the implementation of the DAO that I'm suggesting for you, right? Here's my submit. Perhaps that'd be a better name, submit quiz, as opposed to create attempt. Create attempt is a little bit too generic. Submit quiz seems a little more specific to the domain. So the API would be that I would pass you the ID of the quiz for which I am submitting this quiz attempt. And then the actual attempt. Now the attempt, remember, the attempt is going to come from the client. The client is going to have a copy of all the questions, right? And that's what it's going to use to render all its questions. So it's going to send it to us, right? But is most of what's is being passed back from the client, most of it is what we had sent it, right, a while back. The only difference is that what comes from the client is going to have an added field, which is the answer that the student gave, right? So let's grab that. So what we're going to do is that we're going to grab, say copy, and so we're going to implement here the submit. So the submit implementation is to do the following. Let's add some lines here so we can read this. Okay. So what it's going to do is that it's going to use the model. It's going to do an insert, right? I want to insert. And notice that the structure is the structure for the schema for the attempts, right? Notice I have the quiz, which is an ID. And indeed, I am passing an ID. I also going to have a score, which is a number, right? We'll talk about that in a second. And then we have the answers, and the answer is going to be an array of questions. And indeed, remember, right? The attempts is going to come back as an array from the client. There's going to have the original array of questions plus an additional field answers. Okay, and then that's what's going to be stored in the database. Okay. For finding all the attempts, well, that's easy, right? It's just we'll need the ID of the quiz. We'll need the ID of the quiz, right? And we can use the quiz model, do a find so we can retrieve the quiz, and once we have the quiz. Once we have the quiz, what I've done here is that, remember, if I find the quiz, right, the schema is that the quiz is just an ID, right? So if I return the attempts, if I just return the ID, well, that's not going to be very useful for whoever is trying to render these attempts. I want to be able to render, what quiz, what score you got for each one of the quizzes, right? Well, the score is going to come through, right, because it's just a number. But the quiz is just going to be an ID. So here I'm populating and I'm saying, hey, populate that quiz. I don't want the ID. I want the original quiz. Because one of the things that I want to do is I want to know what the original title of the quiz, so I can render it for you on the user interface and say, oh, you got, this is what you got, and for this quiz, for this attempt. And so populate up to this point, right, we had seen examples that we can provide and ask what field we want to populate. And if I leave it like that, it's going to populate everything in the quiz. And I might not want to do that, right? For instance, I don't want the questions, right? Instead, populate takes a second argument. Populate takes a list of the fields that you want to populate, right? I want the title and I want the ID of the quiz. I want those two. So because I want to render the name of the quiz. Okay. How about this score here? So the score, what we're going to do is that we're going to iterate. We're going to calculate the score. We're going to assume that all the questions have the same weight, right? And what we're going to do is that we're going to iterate over all the questions, and we're going to compare the answer that the student gave. We're going to compare it against the correct answer, right? And we're going to count how many questions are correct, and we're going to calculate the ratio of how many you got right, against how many questions there were, and that's going to be your score. So that's exactly what I'm providing here as an example, right, where we're going to calculate the score based on the attempt. So I'm going to copy this here, right? So So these attempts, right, are just what? It's just an array of questions, right? And we're going to iterate over all the questions. There it is. So we're iterating over the questions for each. And as we iterate, we're going to return the, oops. Okay, we're going to, this is not formatted nicely. Let me format it like this, like that, yeah. So as this for each is iterating over each one of the questions, is going to compare each one of the answers in the question, is going to compare it against the correct answer of the same question. This is what the student gave, and this is what we had configured as the correct answer. If they're the same, then I'm going to increment the number of correct questions. If not, I'm just going to leave it alone. And then what I'm going to return from the score is going to be the ratio of the number of questions, number of correct questions divided by how many questions there were multiplied by 100. Okay, and that's what I'm going to use the value for the score. That makes sense? Any questions so far?